Should Elder Scrolls 6 launch in early access? So, is traditional development just not suited for open world RPGs that just continue to grow in size and complexity? Based on recent things that we've heard about Elder Scrolls 6, they already have playable builds, very early playable builds. I'm actually worried they're going to make the mistake of not leveraging something that very clearly helped one of the biggest games recently, Baldur's Gate 3. The depth and the complexity and the freedom in Baldur's Gate 3 would not have been possible without early access. Now, I've argued in other places the same thing for Diablo 4. I think it would have been greatly helped by early access as well. Once the game's out, it's just too big to make system-wide changes in an effective way. It's sort of like trying to turn an aircraft carrier. So I want to walk through some recent things that we have learned about what they're doing with this game. They already have playable versions, and we know they're probably going to be setting their sights on a very large and ambitious game, but there's also just some commentary about the release windows, things that we learned from the FTC trial. And I want to look at the early access idea and what it brings to the table for games like Baldur's Gate 3 and what it could do for Elder Scrolls 6. And I want to sort of compare that to traditional development and what that might look like for Elder Scrolls. Then I'm going to sort of end by making some of my predictions. Many are going to push back. They're going to be like, this is out of the question. They're never going to do this. Why would you say that they should do this? Bethesda's just not going to be even allowed to consider that. So what have we heard? So Bethesda took to Twitter to sort of celebrate 30 years of Elder Scrolls. And in the post, they confirmed that they haven't just begun working on Elder Scrolls 6, but that they have early builds. And they said, quote, "Even now, returning to Tamriel and playing early builds has us filled with the same joy, excitement, and promise of adventure." So for some, this might be exciting. And for those hoping for an engine change, probably not so much. Like many people have said that they need to get away from the creation engine, but I don't think Bethesda at this point can. It's probably out of the question. There's just too many years of institutional knowledge to just suddenly switch engines, because people have been kind of pulling for that ever since Fallout 4. That's been a part of the discussion, and I think that discussion got more footing when Starfield came out. I do think the engine's age did start to show up the most in Starfield. Now, hopefully they can learn some good lessons, and since they're just sort of building one world, it might be quite a bit more handcrafted, and they can sort of return to their Bethesdian roots. And when it comes to the release date, we actually have some things that came out of the FTC trial. First, there was a chart that showed Xbox's sort of post-acquisition plans for Bethesda, and Elder Scrolls was listed as a game that would land in 2026 or later. Now, this same chart also had a checkbox, and there was an X in it, and it indicated that Elder Scrolls 6 would not be landing on PlayStation. Now, since then, we have had pretty strong claims from Tom Warren of The Verge that Elder Scrolls 6 will not be an Xbox exclusive, and it will land on PlayStation day one. This is sort of given all the changes and the brand pivot for Xbox. I don't find what Tom's saying surprising. A game of this size and scope, if you look at the history of Bethesda games on PlayStation, it just makes sense. This is kind of driving one of my thoughts behind why I believe that Starfield will eventually end up on PlayStation. But during the FTC trial, Phil Spencer gave a very different release window than that document and that chart and what it indicated. At the time, Phil would not give a definitive answer about platforms either, which is really interesting. He said, quote, "With Elder Scrolls 6, it's so far out, it's hard to understand what platforms it will even be at this point. It's the same team that's finishing Starfield, which comes out this September, so we're talking about a game that's like 5+ years away." So he made these remarks in 2023, so Elder Scrolls 6 is probably on course for a 2028 release or later, which I think sounds way better than 2026. 4 or 5 years for a game of this size, that's likely what they're going to need. If they're going to want, minimum time frame for excellence, you're going to need Elder Scrolls 6 to cook for at least 5 years. But given that we do have two potential launch windows and launch targets, could 2026, could that work as an early access launch, right? And at this point, I just think it's undeniable. I think there's an ample amount of evidence that Baldur's Gate 3 achieved a level of freedom and of excellence that's not really been seen or found in any other RPGs in the market. To this day, I still see clips, examples of things that people are discovering and doing, and they're just enjoying the depth of just a big, massive game. And we also have to give credit where credit is due. The game handily won Game of the Year and a handful of other game awards. Games of this size and having dev cycles this long, it's an enormous risk to gamble with those foundational decisions. Much of what was criticized in Diablo 4 could have been avoided with respect to the skill trees. They were just too linear. They were very boring. And that could have been alleviated. That could have been avoided if people were playing the game in its, an earlier state. Maybe just build Act 1, but let people play with all that. So much of the game is built upon those systems. Your loot tables, your end game leveling, the enemies themselves, things like the Paragon boards. It's all connected. So moving or adjusting anything requires a massive amount of work. RPG systems are complex. If one ability, just one ability is adjusted, any weapon, any armor piece, or passive ability that interacts with that one ability would then also need to be potentially adjusted or bug tested. That's just one ability. If you think about all the abilities and all the various things you can spend skill points in, it's usually just one ability is like a spider web in connections to all of these other things. So beyond just the internal logistics of making changes, we've been hearing a lot about game budgets lately as well. The projects and the games aren't just getting bigger, the budgets are getting bigger as well, and so studios decide to build a game of this size and scope, like Elder Scrolls. You simply have to nail it. You can't end up with the Cyberpunk, okay? You're going to often hear people bring up how many copies of Cyberpunk sold, acting like, well, it wasn't really a disaster. They sold a ton of copies. They made a ton of money. CD Projekt Red's stock value still has not recovered. It was close to $25 a share before Cyberpunk, and even after the redemption arc that Cyberpunk has been on, they're still sitting at $7 a share. That's a huge, massive amount of loss. That level of loss is felt not just by the company, but by the shareholders as well. They had to settle with their shareholders, okay? I can't help but think that Elder Scrolls 6 has even more on the line. It's a more well-known title. It's like almost monolithic in the history of games. Now, some are going to push back and they're going to say, listen, a game this big, executives are just not going to allow for early access. They're going to push for heavy marketing, heavy pre-order incentives, and they're going to try to make as much money as possible. That's probably correct. I don't think anybody saying that is wrong. But it's also directly related to games not reaching their full potential because they're being treated like products instead of art projects. So let me be clear with what I think. I strongly believe that Elder Scrolls 6 should launch in early access. I really do fear that traditional development will not work. Imagine building all of the skill trees and foundational loot systems, and then you just create the opening area, all right? The amount that they would learn from just a month of player feedback would be worth its weight in gold. No matter how much internal testing you do, no matter how much market research you do, you will never be able to achieve what you can learn in just 48 hours of public gameplay from millions of players. Now, this would enable the devs to craft the mid-game and the end-game in a far better way. I remember reading a book where the author gave an example of they were flying a small plane and like dropping off medical supplies in various countries. I believe they were flying in Africa. And basically the pilot would every once in a while let him steer the plane. And the pilot would get very stern if the trajectory was off just by like a little bit, okay? This was because a slight miscalculation by a few degrees would put them in the wrong country, right? They could get shot down. They could anything could happen. They could get lost. They could run out of fuel. In similar fashion, design choices made for the foundations of a game, they can show up as mistakes or miscalculations, oftentimes when it's just too late. The game's built. All the parts of the game are now intertwined. You can't just press undo. I believe the expectations for games like Elder Scrolls are simply too high to use traditional development. All the decisions they make when they're making those foundational choices, those could be miscalculations. And you don't know they're miscalculations until the game is in the hands of the public 5 or 6 years later, because it took that long for those arcs to take root. So allow me to make some predictions. If they go with traditional development, I fear we're going to get another Starfield. I mean that. I think Starfield largely felt like Fallout 5. Entire systems were just lifted carbon copy from Fallout. Those who are praising Starfield for its innovation had clearly never played Fallout 4 or Skyrim. And it's my belief that traditional development is just not suited for games of this size. It's just going to lead to them playing it safe. This is one of the reasons that we see a lot of sequels right now, a lot of remasters, a lot of remakes. The bigger the budget, the bigger the game, the less risk that they're going to be willing to take. And I really can't blame companies for this. You've got to survive. You've got to make profit if you want to keep your doors open. My prediction is that if they were to do early access, they could do far more iterating and innovating. Imagine the number of classes that they're likely going to have in a game like Elder Scrolls 6. Think of the creativity, the innovation, and the new ideas that they could bring to the RPG genre. They've made such an impact on open world RPGs. They could do it again. That's far more likely to happen in an early access environment. Do you think Larian would have been able to offer the level of freedom and the creativity that players have if they would have just built Baldur's Gate 3 traditionally? Or even other games, like Hades as an example. They went through a lot of major changes when they were in early access, and it helped them launch a game that got a lot of recognition and a lot of awards. And they're also planning on releasing Hades 2 in early access. So clearly it works. And I think it would be an undeniable benefit for a game like Elder Scrolls 6. But that's just what I think. What do you think?